$60 billion is the amount that China's President Xi Jinping pledged for new projects in Africa at the latest annual Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing earlier this month in September 2018. The African leaders are buzzing as they see more money coming to Africa for areas ranging from industrial promotion, infrastructure construction, and even scholarships for young Africans. It's now been almost 10 years since China surpassed the United States to become Africa's largest trading partner back in 2009. African leaders dismiss Western critics who talk about the Chinese debt trap as they welcome more Chinese money to the country. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa dismissed the view of a new colonialism taking hold in Africa, while Rwandan President Paul Kagame called talk of debt traps as attempts to discourage African-Chinese interactions. Is Chinese investment in Africa a new form of colonialism? What do Africans think and what do the facts say? I'm Kasim, this is KJ Vids, and in this video we will look at China's investments in Africa.
China is energy hungry.
Until the early 1990s, China was once the largest oil exporter in Asia. In 1993, for the first time, China became a net importer of oil, and according to the US Energy Information Administration, China surpassed the United States at the end of 2013 as the world's largest net importer of petroleum and other liquids. In the last few decades, China's rapid economic growth has fueled an unprecedented need for resources, making it the world's largest energy consumer and producer in the world. In order to fuel its industrialization, China has focused on securing long-term energy supplies and searched for secure access to oil suppliers and other raw materials around the globe, making China influential in world energy markets. With the largest population and a rapidly growing economy, the country's high overall energy demand triggered China's quest for securing energy resources. China's second largest source of crude imports after the Middle East is Africa, from which it receives almost 1.5 billion barrels per day, according to the South China Morning Post. Angola was China's third largest oil supplier in 2016, and other African oil suppliers include the Republic of Congo and South Sudan. Chinese investment in Africa fits into Chinese President Xi Jinping's One Belt One Road development framework, which joins a continental economic belt and a maritime road to promote cooperation and interconnectivity from Eurasia to Africa.
Sino-African trade.
China's ties to the continent trace back to the early post-colonial history of many states. Beijing forged relationships with African countries as they first gained independence and used diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China over Taiwan as a bargaining tool, rewarding countries who sided with Beijing instead of Taiwan. By the mid-1990s, China began enhancing its economic relationship with key African oil exporters and recalibrated its approach by focusing on economic relationships and having a policy of non-interference in African governmental affairs. China's non-interference policy and respect for sovereignty allows assistance to be provided to repressive governments in countries like Sudan and Zimbabwe with much-needed investment. Whilst the majority of Africa's exports to China are comprised of mineral fuels, lubricants and related materials, it also exports iron ore, metals and other commodities, as well as small amounts of food and agricultural products. China exports a range of machinery, transportation, communications equipment as well as manufactured goods to African countries.
Chinese financing.
In its quest to secure resources, China engages in a form of commercial diplomacy that most other countries cannot match. China is bigger, wealthier and has more leverage in negotiations than any single African country, hence the ease with which China has developed secure relations with nearly every state in sub-Saharan Africa. Michael Levy and Elizabeth Economy argued in their book By All Means Necessary that Beijing pitches vast trade assistance and investment deals on frequent trips to resource-rich countries and retains an almost unparalleled ability to provide low-cost financing and cheap labour for infrastructure projects. China has built it all, from the new ring road around Nairobi to the reconstructed Tazara railway between Tanzania and Zambia, and ports, hospitals, research centres, skyscrapers and power plants. To give a sense of the magnitude, the Chinese have helped build about 300 massive dams in Africa. In no sector have the Chinese been more critical to sub-Saharan Africa than in the construction of dams to provide hydropower for local industry, local consumption, and potential export. China is busy building the dams that the World Bank and other Western donors have disdained because of serious environmental concerns or disagreements with host governments about economic viability. China has gone ahead and constructed them regardless. Africans pay for all of these infrastructural improvements by pledging oil and gas shipments, copper or iron ore exports, and other commodities. China in return provides a mix of loans, cash or bartered commodities that Africa returns to China. Sometimes China writes off the loans to secure these endeavours, and sometimes it provides soft loans and extends long lines of credit. But whatever the financial arrangement, the African countries receive the new roads and everything else that their expanding populations require. Although the ruling elites profit from rents and kickbacks, overall Africans have a favourable view towards China.
Is China colonizing Africa?
An influential Nigerian paper called The Leadership reported that a recent online search found over 51 million articles on China and Africa, making it one of the most recognized and talked about international engagements. But the portrayal of the Chinese investments in Africa have been particularly negative in the West, with headlines such as "Is China good or bad for Africa?", "Collaboration or Colonialism?", "China aid to Africa, monster or messiah?". In 2011, Hillary Clinton was asked in a television interview in Zambia about China's rising influence in the continent and said Africans should be wary of friends who only deal with elites. "We don't want to see a new colonialism in Africa." Earlier this year, the former US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson also warned against African nations accepting Chinese loans, saying, "We are not in any way attempting to keep Chinese dollars from Africa." Such quotes by Western leaders are ironic, considering how the IMF and World Bank have exploited their monopoly on currency since World War II. We have seen predatory loan practices from the financial institutions of the West more than in any other time in history, and there are plenty of case studies from the Middle East to Latin America. But according to an expert, the reality of Chinese investments in Africa is very different to the way it is portrayed by Western leaders, as explained by author of the book called "Will Africa Feed China?" by Deborah Portigam, who is the Professor of International Political Economy and Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. In an article for the Washington Post earlier this year, she challenged the myth that China is grabbing African land to grow food and send back to feed China. She talked about 3 areas to demonstrate that what we are seeing in Africa is a story of globalization, not colonization. Let's look at all 3. First, in relation to jobs and trading, she quotes Lena Ben Abdallah, who is a political science professor at Wake Forest University and studies investments in African human resource development programs, who said that Africans are being invited to Chinese universities. China is offering scholarships. When Africans are thinking about technology and skills, they are thinking of China as a valid option. Surveys of employment on Chinese projects in Africa repeatedly find that 3/4 or more of the workers are in fact local. And there is an economic reason for this. In China, textile workers now earn about $500 a month, far more than workers in most African countries. Chinese investors flocking to set up factories in low-cost countries like Ethiopia are not thinking about importing Chinese workers. Like US and European factory owners who moved their factories to China in past decades, Chinese firms are now outsourcing their own manufacturing to cheap countries. Secondly, on predatory lending, she quoted scholars at Boston University and Johns Hopkins University who have been assembling databases of Chinese loans provided since the year 2000. She said that they found that China had lent at least $95.5 billion between 2000 and 2015. That's a lot of debt, yet by and large, the Chinese loans in our database were performing a useful service, financing Africa's serious infrastructure gap. On a continent where over 600 million Africans have no access to electricity, 40% of the Chinese loans paid for power generation and transmission. Another 30% went to modernizing Africa's crumbling transport infrastructure. Questions have been raised about this quality, yet on the whole, power and transport are investments that boost economic growth. And they found that Chinese loans generally have comparatively low interest rates and long repayment periods. Finally, on land grabs, a term used to describe purchase, rental or theft of large amounts of land. such as the way Britain and France grabbed nearly the entire continent. She explains that after all, China has 9% of the world's arable land, 6% of its water, and over 20% of its people. Africa has plentiful land, so Chinese companies were clearly interested in investing in Africa. In response to the rumours of land grab, Deborah set up a research project. Her team collected a database of 57 cases where Chinese firms or the government were alleged to have acquired or negotiated large amounts of African farmland, over 500 hectares. If all of these media reports had been real news, this would have accounted to a very alarming 6 million hectares, 1% of all the farmland in Africa. Deborah and her team spent 3 years tracking down every single case. We travelled from Madagascar to Mozambique, Zimbabwe to Zambia. We confirmed that nearly a third of these stories, including the 3 above, were literally false. In the remaining cases, we found real Chinese investments, but the total amount of land actually acquired by Chinese firms was only about 240,000 hectares, 4% of the reported amount. She concluded that the stories of large-scale land grabbing and Chinese peasants being shipped to Africa to grow food for China turned out to be mostly myths. As researchers at the Center for International Forestry Research concluded after their own rigorous research, China is not a dominant investor in plantation agriculture in Africa, in contrast to how it is often portrayed. We found a story of globalization, not colonization, a story of African agency rather than Chinese rapacity.
What do Africans think of China?
What do Africans think of China? Public opinion is a key factor in determining policies and impacts politics. China has now significantly been dealing in Africa for over a decade. Afrobarometer is a Pan-African non-partisan research network that conducts public attitudes. In October 2016, they published a report in which their findings demonstrated that on average across 36 African countries, almost 2/3 of Africans say China's influence is somewhat or very positive, while only 15% see it as somewhat or very negative. The most favourable views were most common in Mali, Niger and Liberia. A majority of Africans also see China's development assistance as doing somewhat or a very good job of meeting their country's needs. The survey found that it's not the Chinese culture or language that Africans like best, but the potential of financial investment China brings. When asked which factors contributed most to China's positive image, it was investment in infrastructure that came out on top.
Does China only hire Chinese?
China is no godsend, but is ultimately a nation seeking its own interests. Interests almost always trump morals under the global system of capitalism, and money always comes first. African traders complain about competition from Chinese migrants and Chinese bosses who expect long hours at low pay. The number of Chinese immigrants in Africa has risen 7-fold over less than 2 decades, and due to cultural differences and working expectations, sometimes the situation has got very intense. In 2011, a lawyer for 2 Chinese coal mine managers in Zambia were jailed after failing to appear in court on accusations of firing upon protesting workers. The managers were charged with 12 counts of attempted murder after firing on workers protesting during a wage dispute in the southern African nation. Nearly a dozen miners were also injured in a separate shooting. Beijing has less and less ability to control these companies, says Ian Taylor, a professor at Scotland's University of St Andrews. Zambia in particular has experienced civil strife in response to an influx of Chinese companies. In 2012, the country witnessed protests and even deaths of Chinese mine managers. Another criticism is that working conditions in Chinese enterprises are problematic, often involving health and safety hazards and long working hours. For example, an explosion accident at the Beijing General Research Institute of Mining in 2005 killed 52 Zambian employees and provoked fierce resentment from the local community against the Chinese investors. Critics have also blamed the Chinese for not hiring local workers, although this criticism has been refuted by Tang Xiaoyang, who is a deputy director of the Carnegie Shinko Center for Global Policy. He found in his research that the employment of local workers is both encouraged by governments and motivated by economic calculation. But China has still been criticized for paying low wages, having precarious working conditions, and providing little training. The International Trade Union Confederation's Hong Kong Liaison Office suggested that Chinese companies' wage is amongst the lowest in many African countries, and they usually pay less than other foreign investors.
Africa needs China more than China needs Africa.
Whilst there have been accusations of exploitative behaviour by China in Africa questioning their long-term relationship, experts say that while China's economic footprint in Africa is growing, it only represents a fraction of China's economic activity around the world. Yun Sun from the Brookings Institution said considering the low priority of Africa in China's overall foreign strategic mapping, a disproportionate level of international attention, publicity and scrutiny is paid to China's Africa engagement. An article in The Conversation bluntly summarises the nature of Chinese investment in Africa. The Chinese are not 21st century colonialists. They have not come to Africa to uplift the locals, to evangelise, to end the slave trade or to find themselves. Africa is not an existential endeavour for the Chinese, although more than 1 million have already decided to settle permanently in Africa as farmers, fishermen, plantation owners, bankers, educators and serial entrepreneurs. For China, it is all about profits and engines of growth. As Africa's population soars in this century almost to equal China's and India's combined, only China can supply the income stream essential to support the enhanced social services and demographic dividend required if Africa over the next few decades is going to emerge from poverty to take its rightful strong position in a troubled world.
China-African relations deeper by the day.
China will continue to play a significant role in Africa, and Africa is generally content with China's investment. This relationship is becoming deeper by the day due to quite simply the growing needs of China and the abundance of resource in Africa. The story is less of a story of colonization and more of a story of globalization. It is certainly not an equal relationship as such, since China has far more economic leverage over Africa considering its relatively small portion of China's global footprint. But I doubt that this relationship will go untroubled, and we are likely to hear much more from African countries on this in the near future. Thanks for watching and see you next time. I hope we all learned something from this video and developed a further interest in international politics. If you would like to support our channel, you can do so in the following 3 ways. First is to subscribe to our channel and be sure to tick the bell icon for alerts on our latest videos. Second is to keep us non-partisan and an independent channel by helping us to grow and prosper through financial contributions. You can join our monthly Patreon account or make a one-off donation to our crowdfunding platform on fundmypage.com. Finally is to engage with our videos by sharing your opinions in the comments below. We love to hear from you and we do read every single comment. Thanks for watching again and see you next time.